The Donbas region, located in eastern Ukraine, had been a focal point of contention since the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. Rich in coal, manganese, and heavy industry, it was one of the most important economic centers of the Soviet Union. For Germany, the conquest of the Donbas promised to deprive the Soviet war economy of vital raw materials while supplying the Reich with resources essential for sustaining its own industry. For the Soviet Union, defending and, later, regaining the Donbas became both an economic necessity and a matter of national prestige. By the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front was entering a new phase. The defeat of German forces at Stalingrad in February, yet the German counteroffensive in the spring and the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 showed that the Wehrmacht still retained the capacity to strike back with large armored formations. When Operation Citadel failed in July, the initiative on the Eastern Front shifted decisively. The Soviets seized the opportunity to launch a series of coordinated offensives designed to liberate occupied territories and inflict continuous pressure on German forces. Among these, the Donbas strategic offensive held particular importance because of its economic and symbolic weight. The German 1st Panzer Army and 6th Army, under Army Group South commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, were tasked with defending the region. Together, these forces comprised roughly 540,000 men, supported by around 900 tanks and assault guns, as well as several thousand artillery pieces. Their mission was to hold the industrial basin, deny the Soviets access to its resources, and stabilize the southern flank of the front. However, these formations were stretched thin, weakened by losses at Kursk and in earlier battles, and faced increasing shortages of replacements, fuel, and ammunition. On the Soviet side, the Southwestern Front under Army General Rodion Malinovsky and the Southern Front under Army General Fyodor Tolbukhin prepared to conduct a major strike against the German defenses in the Donbas. The combined Soviet force included approximately 1,050,000 men, supported by more than 1,250 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 14,000 artillery pieces and mortars. In addition, the 17th Air Army and 8th Air Army provided air support with more than 1,200 combat aircraft. The operation was to be part of a larger strategic scheme, simultaneous offensives across the front that would prevent the Wehrmacht from concentrating its reserves in any single sector. Conditions in the Donbas were challenging. The region's terrain combined open steppe with industrial centers, mines, and rivers that could serve as defensive barriers. The Germans had constructed fortified positions around key cities such as Stalino, later Donetsk, Voroshilovgrad, later Luhansk, and the surrounding coal-producing areas. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, recognized that any assault would face not only entrenched German forces, but also logistical obstacles in moving large formations across rivers like the Mius and the Seversky Donets. Nevertheless, the political and strategic imperatives were clear. By liberating the Donbas, the Soviet Union would reclaim a vital industrial base, demonstrate to its population that lost territory could be restored, and undermine German ability to sustain its war economy. For Germany, losing the Donbas would mean conceding the fruits of 2 years of occupation. Thus, as the summer of 1943 ended, both sides braced for a campaign that would determine control over one of the most important regions of the Eastern Front. The stage was set for the Donbas Strategic Offensive, a massive Soviet undertaking that would unfold between August and September 1943. It would test the resilience of German defenses, the capacity of the Red Army to conduct deep operations, and the ability of both sides to adapt to the rapidly changing balance of power on the Eastern Front. What followed would not only reshape the map of southern Ukraine, but also signal that the Red Army had reached a new stage in its warfighting capabilities. The Donbas Strategic Offensive began on 13 August 1943, when the Soviet southwestern and southern fronts initiated their assault against German defenses. The opening phase targeted the Mius River line, a heavily fortified German position. The German Sixth Army, reconstituted after its destruction at Stalingrad, held this sector with a mix of experienced and newly transferred units. Soviet intelligence estimated that German forces numbered around 250,000 in this line alone, backed by dense concentrations of artillery and well-prepared defensive belts. The Southern Front, under General Fyodor Tolbukhin, spearheaded the initial attack. After massive artillery preparation, Soviet infantry and armored units advanced across the Mius. The German defenders, experienced in positional warfare, resisted fiercely. Over the next several days, Soviet forces achieved limited gains, suffering heavy casualties as they attempted to break through the main defensive belt. The Sixth Army counterattacked with local reserves, including elements of the 17th Panzer Division, managing to contain the advance temporarily. Soviet losses were significant in these first days, but the Stavka had committed to sustaining pressure across the front, anticipating that German reserves would be drawn into battle and exhausted. Simultaneously, the Southwestern Front, under General Rodion Malinovsky, launched its assault north of the Mius sector, aiming to break through German defenses along the Seversky Donets River. Here, the Soviet 1st Guards Army and 3rd Guards Army led the attack, supported by strong artillery and airstrikes. Once again, progress was slow. The Germans had built formidable positions, and the terrain made river crossings costly. Nevertheless, Soviet forces managed to secure several bridgeheads under heavy fire. German command responded with urgency. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, redeployed elements of the 1st Panzer Army and mobile divisions to contain the Soviet penetrations. The Wehrmacht's ability to shift reserves quickly was still intact, and for a time it appeared that the Soviet offensives might be blunted, as earlier attempts to breach the Mius line had been repelled in July. The Germans launched counterstrokes using the 23rd Panzer Division and SS divisions transferred from other sectors, inflicting losses on Soviet spearheads. However, the Soviet command adapted by broadening the offensive. Instead of focusing on a single breakthrough point, both Tolbukhin and Malinovsky extended their pressure across a wider front, forcing the Germans to defend multiple sectors simultaneously. The Soviet air forces intensified their strikes, targeting German artillery positions and rear supply lines. The weather, typical of late summer in the steppe, provided relatively clear conditions that favored air operations, allowing the Red Army to make greater use of its growing numerical superiority in the air. By the 3rd week of August, the cumulative effect of continuous assaults began to wear down German defenders. Soviet artillery barrages destroyed key strongpoints, and infantry units slowly pried open gaps in the defensive belts. The German command struggled to maintain cohesion as losses mounted. Even as counterattacks were launched, the Soviets absorbed them and pushed forward, relying on reserves positioned for sustained offensive action. The opening phase of the Donbas offensive thus revealed the evolving character of the Eastern Front in 1943. The Red Army demonstrated greater coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, as well as improved logistical support for large-scale operations. The Germans, while still formidable in defense and counterattack, increasingly lacked the reserves and material strength to dominate the battlefield as they had in earlier years. By late August, the momentum of the offensive was beginning to shift decisively in favor of the Soviets, setting the stage for deeper penetrations into the Donbas region. The Soviet High Command's strategic planning for the Donbas offensive reflected both lessons learned from previous operations and the larger strategic vision for the second half of 1943. The failure of Operation Citadel at Kursk had shown that the Wehrmacht no longer possessed the strength for large-scale offensives, while Soviet forces had reached a level of operational maturity that allowed for coordinated, multi-front campaigns. Stavka's orders for the southwestern and southern fronts were not simply to breach German defenses, but to encircle and destroy enemy groupings while simultaneously liberating the Donbas industrial basin. The primary Soviet objective was twofold. First, to break the German Mias and Seversky Donets defensive lines and push the Wehrmacht out of eastern Ukraine. Second, to re-establish control over coal mines, steel plants, and transportation hubs vital to the Soviet economy. Malinovsky's southwestern front was to deliver the main blow toward Voroshilovgrad, while Tolbukin's southern front aimed to advance through Stalino and the southern Donbas. Together, their offensives would converge, cutting off large portions of German Army Group South and compelling a general retreat. To achieve this, the Soviets assembled overwhelming concentrations of manpower and material. Combined, both fronts deployed over 1 million men, 14,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and more than 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns. Ammunition stocks were built up for sustained artillery barrages, and pontoon bridging equipment was moved forward to facilitate river crossings. Crucially, Soviet air forces had also grown in strength. The 8th and 17th Air Armies, together fielding over 1,200 combat aircraft, were tasked with disrupting German troop movements, isolating the battlefield, and providing direct support to ground forces. The German strategic goals, in contrast, were largely defensive. After the failure at Kursk, Hitler and the OKH, Army High Command, had ordered Army Group South under Manstein to hold the Donbas at all costs. The region's coal production, approximately 60% of Soviet pre-war output, was essential for German industry and railways. Moreover, Hitler viewed the Donbas as a political symbol of occupation, evidence of German control deep in Soviet territory. Manstein was instructed to preserve the industrial resources by conducting a stubborn defense, relying on fortified river lines while preparing mobile reserves for counterattacks. The German order of battle in the Donbas included the reconstituted 6th Army, numbering about 250,000 men, and the 1st Panzer Army with around 290,000. These forces fielded 900 tanks and assault guns and approximately 5,000 artillery pieces. However, they faced severe logistical problems. Supply lines stretched from bases in central Ukraine and Romania, vulnerable to partisan attacks. Fuel shortages limited the mobility of armored reserves, and losses from Kursk had not yet been replaced. The Luftwaffe, weakened by heavy attrition on the Eastern Front and commitments in the Mediterranean, could provide only limited air support, numbering roughly 500 operational aircraft in the sector. The Germans also miscalculated Soviet intentions. Expecting the Red Army to pause after Kursk for reorganization, they underestimated the speed with which the Soviets could redeploy forces and launch new offensives. Soviet deception measures, including feints in other sectors, further concealed the scale of the buildup. By the time Manstein realized the size of the Soviet operation, his reserves were already committed piecemeal to containing breakthroughs. Propaganda played a role on both sides. German communiques emphasized the resilience of their troops and portrayed Soviet attacks as costly and unsuccessful, even as pressure mounted. Soviet propaganda, meanwhile, stressed the liberation of occupied cities and villages, highlighting both the economic importance of the Donbas and the suffering of civilians under German occupation. The offensive was presented to the Soviet population as a step toward reclaiming lost territory and avenging earlier defeats of 1941-42. Thus, the strategic planning and goals of both sides diverged sharply. The Soviets sought decisive territorial and operational gains, supported by growing material superiority and a clear logistical framework for sustained offensive action. The Germans aimed to hold their ground, preserve resources, and buy time, despite dwindling reserves and overstretched lines. As the Soviet attacks unfolded in August 1943, the mismatch between these goals and realities became increasingly evident, setting the stage for the next phase of brutal engagements in the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union. The first clashes of the Donbas strategic offensive began in mid-August 1943, when Soviet formations launched coordinated assaults along the Mius River and the Seversky Donets. These lines had been carefully fortified by the Wehrmacht over months of occupation, with deep trench systems, concrete bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions dug into the Germans considered the Mius line in particular to be nearly impregnable, having repelled previous Soviet assaults earlier in the summer. Yet the Soviet High Command was determined to breach it, employing concentrated firepower and coordinated infantry armor attacks supported by massed artillery and aviation. On August 13th, the Southwestern Front opened its offensive toward Voroshilovgrad. The 57th Army, supported by the 23rd Tank Corps, struck at German defenses near the Seversky Donets. Simultaneously, the 6th Army, under Lieutenant General Ivan Schliemann, attacked further south, tying down German reserves. Heavy artillery bombardments preceded the infantry assaults, with reports indicating that up to 150 guns per kilometer were massed along some breakthrough sectors. Despite this, German defenders, composed largely of divisions from the reconstituted 6th Army, including the 17th Panzer and 294th Infantry Divisions, fought stubbornly, counterattacking with mobile groups and inflicting significant losses. The fighting devolved into close-quarters battles across river crossings and within fortified positions. The Southern Front, commanded by Tolbukin, began its assault on August 18th against the German 6th Army along the Mius. Here, Soviet forces deployed the 5th Shock Army and 28th Army, supported by the 2nd Guards Mechanized Corps. The Mius River was defended by the German 17th Army Corps and parts of the 257th Infantry Division, which had prepared defensive belts in depth. Initial Soviet attempts to force the river were costly. Assault engineers struggled to clear minefields under fire, while pontoon bridges were repeatedly destroyed by German artillery and air. The Luftwaffe, though reduced in strength, concentrated its sorties on these crossings, targeting Soviet bridging equipment and supply convoys. Yet Soviet persistence gradually wore down the defenders. After several days of grinding combat, breakthrough groups succeeded in establishing bridgeheads, bringing forward tanks and artillery. On August 20-21, the 2nd Guards Mechanized Corps pushed deeper into the German rear, forcing the Wehrmacht to divert mobile reserves, including elements of the 16th Panzer Grenadier Division, to contain the breach. This commitment of reserves at critical junctures weakened German ability to react to subsequent Soviet pushes along a wider front. Civilian populations were directly caught in the opening engagements. Villages in the Donbas had been heavily fortified by the Wehrmacht, with buildings turned into strongpoints and local inhabitants subjected to forced labor constructing defenses. Soviet artillery bombardments devastated many of these settlements, while German rear units carried out scorched earth policies, destroying coal pits, machine shops, and rail junctions before retreating. Eyewitness accounts from liberated villages later recorded both relief at the Soviet advance and devastation of homes, with food stocks burned and livestock slaughtered. The morale of Soviet troops was buoyed by the liberation of the first towns. Units advancing through destroyed industrial sites often encountered civilians who had endured 2 years of occupation. Reports describe how Soviet political officers emphasized these encounters, linking military progress to national recovery. Conversely, German soldiers fought under increasingly difficult conditions. The Wehrmacht's command sought to hold positions through strict discipline, with records noting that desertion rates rose and entire platoons of conscripts were subjected to punishment for withdrawal without orders. Unexpected outcomes marked these initial clashes. At several points, German counterattacks managed to encircle Soviet spearheads temporarily, inflicting losses and delaying progress. For example, near Krasny Luch, Soviet tank brigades advancing too quickly were cut off by a coordinated strike of the 23rd Panzer Division, resulting in the destruction of more than 40 tanks before relief arrived. However, these local successes could not halt the broader momentum of the offensive. The Red Army, with greater reserves, rotated fresh units into the fight, while German forces had to commit dwindling reserves, often pulled from quieter sectors, thereby weakening their overall defensive posture. Air power shaped the course of the engagements. The Soviet 8th and 17th Air Armies flew hundreds of sorties daily, focusing on interdiction of German supply lines and suppression of artillery. German air units, including Jagdgeschwader 52, attempted to contest air superiority, but numerical inferiority made sustained resistance difficult. Luftwaffe pilots continued to score victories against Soviet aircraft, yet they could not prevent the Red Army from maintaining operational freedom in most sectors. By the end of August 1943, the initial engagements of the Donbas strategic offensive had broken through the first German defensive belts. The Red Army had liberated key localities such as Voroshilovgrad's outskirts and penetrated deeply into the steppe beyond the Meuse. Losses on both sides were heavy. Soviet records acknowledged tens of thousands of casualties in the opening weeks, while German units reported severe attrition, with divisions reduced to half strength after days of fighting. Despite German tactical resilience and occasional counterblows, the operational balance was shifting rapidly in favor of the Soviets, who could sustain momentum through relentless pressure and continuous reinforcements. These early battles established the pattern of the Donbas campaign: costly assaults against entrenched positions, counterattacks that inflicted local reverses, but a steady Soviet advance driven by superior reserves and a clear strategic imperative. The Wehrmacht's inability to halt the breaches in its defensive lines foreshadowed the broader collapse of German positions in eastern Ukraine, while the liberation of the first industrial centers signaled to both sides the immense stakes of the struggle unfolding across the coal-rich steppe. As the fighting spread deeper into the Donbas in early September 1943, the scale of the conflict intensified. Both sides recognized that control of this region carried weight beyond immediate tactical considerations. The Donbas was the Soviet Union's most important industrial basin, producing more than 60% of its coal output before the German invasion. Steel mills, chemical plants, and railway hubs concentrated here provided the economic backbone for wartime industry. For the Germans, holding the region meant continued access to coal and coke essential for their own steel production, as well as denying the Soviets the possibility of reviving their war economy. Thus, the escalating battles were fought with an intensity shaped not only by military calculations, but also by industrial imperatives. German command, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Army Group South, attempted to stabilize the front by reorganizing defensive lines. The remnants of the Sixth Army, rebuilt after the disaster at Stalingrad, now bore much of the burden, along with the First Panzer Army. In total, German strength in the Donbas numbered about 350,000 men, supported by roughly 400 tanks and assault guns, though many divisions were understrength after months of attrition. Soviet forces committed to the offensive reached more than 900,000 troops, organized within the southwestern and southern fronts, with nearly 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns. The numerical disparity underscored the imbalance that was gradually overwhelming German defenses. Reinforcement became a critical issue. The Wehrmacht rushed units such as the 24th Panzer Division and SS Panzer Grenadier formations into the Donbas, but the fragmented rail network and continuous Soviet air interdiction slowed their deployment. At the same time, Soviet command rotated fresh guards units into the offensive, exploiting weak points as soon as they appeared. By mid-September, Entire German corps were struggling to hold elongated fronts, with divisions. Terrain and weather added to the crisis. The open steppe allowed Soviet armored units to maneuver widely, forcing German defenders to constantly reposition mobile reserves. Dust and heat in late summer strained both men and machinery, while dwindling fuel supplies hampered German tank operations. Soviet logistics were also stretched, with long supply lines from the east struggling to keep pace with rapid advances. Still, Soviet command compensated with greater reserves of men and materiel, accepting heavy losses in exchange for continued forward momentum. Political dimensions influenced the escalation. The German High Command feared that losing the Donbas would undermine the Reich's credibility with its allies, particularly Romania and Hungary, whose economic cooperation relied heavily on German strength. Within the Soviet Union, Stalin emphasized the liberation of the Donbas as a matter of national prestige. State propaganda framed the battles as the reconquest of the homeland's industrial heart, further motivating soldiers and civilians alike. Newspapers circulated accounts of workers who had sworn oaths to resume production within days of liberation, reinforcing the narrative that every kilometer regained had economic as well as symbolic value. Civilian suffering deepened as the front advanced. German forces accelerated scorched earth tactics, systematically demolishing industrial infrastructure. Coal mines were flooded, machinery dismantled or destroyed, and rail junctions blown up. Eyewitness accounts describe entire villages evacuated, with livestock driven westward and food stocks requisitioned or burned. For the local population, the escalation of combat meant not only destruction from artillery and bombing, but also deliberate deprivation carried out by retreating occupiers. Soviet authorities later recorded widespread malnutrition and homelessness in liberated districts, complicating the task of restarting production. International observers noted the strategic significance of the battles. Reports reaching London and Washington emphasized the intensity of the Soviet push and the potential collapse of German positions in Ukraine. Allied intelligence estimated that German losses in manpower and equipment in the Donbas could rival those suffered during the retreat from Orel and Kharkov. This growing awareness contributed to Allied confidence that the Eastern Front was decisively turning against the Wehrmacht, reinforcing arguments for increased deliveries of Lend-Lease supplies through the Persian Corridor and Arctic convoys. By late September, escalation had reached its peak. Soviet spearheads pressed toward Stalino, later Donetsk, while German forces attempted counterattacks near Debaltsev and Artemovsk. These counterattacks temporarily delayed Soviet progress, but failed to restore stability. Both sides endured heavy casualties, with Soviet losses for the month estimated at over 100,000 men, while German divisions reported being reduced to 40–50% of their authorized strength. The crisis phase of the campaign thus revealed the limits of German defensive endurance and highlighted the Red Army's growing ability to sustain large-scale offensives despite severe attrition. The Donbas front, by the end of September, stood as a battlefield of exhaustion and escalation. Soviet command pressed relentlessly, conscious of the political and economic stakes, while German leadership confronted the collapse of yet another key sector. The crisis was no longer about holding a river line or a fortified position, but about whether the Wehrmacht could prevent a complete loss of the Donbas industrial basin. This recognition would shape the next phase of the campaign, when the fighting reached its peak in both intensity and strategic consequence. The Donbas strategic offensive reached its peak intensity in October 1943, when the Red Army concentrated maximum pressure along a broad front, stretching from the lower Dnieper to the approaches of Stalino. Soviet operations were coordinated between the Southwestern Front under Rodion Malinovsky and the Southern Front under Fyodor Tolbukhin, together commanding nearly 1 million men, more than 2,200 tanks, and over 2,500 aircraft. Their task was not simply to push the Germans out of the Donbas, but to crush the core of Army Group South's strength and secure the industrial basin before winter. The German command, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, attempted to resist with approximately 350,000 troops and around 400 armored vehicles spread thin across a rapidly collapsing front. The 1st Panzer Army and the rebuilt 6th Army bore the brunt of the fighting. German doctrine emphasized flexible defense, counterattacks, and the use of mobile reserves, but by this stage of the war, those reserves were too weak to regain the initiative. The peak of the campaign saw German divisions operating at half strength, many with only 40-50 tanks available, often short of fuel and ammunition. Urban and industrial centers became focal points of combat. The battles for cities such as Gorlovka, Makeyevka, and Stalino combined house-to-house fighting with heavy artillery bombardments. Soviet infantry divisions advanced in waves, supported by Katyusha rocket launchers and close air support from the 8th Air Army. German defenders, entrenched in factories and mine shafts, resisted with machine gun nests and improvised strongpoints. Civilians were caught in the middle. Many were forced into labor battalions to dig defensive trenches or were displaced by the destruction of their neighborhoods. Reports from Soviet military commissions noted that in liberated towns, only 10–20% of industrial capacity remained intact, with most equipment dismantled or destroyed during the German retreat. Railway hubs became crucial objectives. Control of Debaltseve and Ilovaisk determined the movement of supplies and reinforcements. Soviet forces concentrated armored breakthroughs in these areas, while German units attempted repeated counterattacks to hold the junctions. In one instance, the 23rd Panzer Division managed to halt a Soviet mechanized corps for several days near Debaltseve, inflicting heavy tank losses, but eventually the numerical superiority of Soviet forces overwhelmed the defenders. Once the Red Army secured the railway links, German mobility and supply were further degraded, accelerating the collapse of their positions. Air operations intensified during this peak period. The Soviet 17th Air Army launched hundreds of sorties daily, targeting German artillery, bridges, and supply convoys. Luftwaffe units, including elements of Luftflotte 4, tried to contest air superiority with fighters like the Bf-109 and ground attack aircraft such as the Ju-87, but shortages of fuel and spare parts limited effectiveness. By late October, Soviet air forces had gained local dominance, allowing them to interdict German movements and support deep armored thrusts. For the civilian population, the peak of the campaign was catastrophic. Villages were destroyed by artillery duels, mines and infrastructure were deliberately sabotaged. German scorched earth policies resulted in the flooding of mines and the systematic demolition of industrial complexes. Soviet reports noted that by the time Stalino was retaken on 8 September 1943, more than 80% of its industrial facilities were rendered unusable. Similar patterns followed across the Donbas, ensuring that liberation came with immense human and material costs. Political leadership on both sides closely monitored the fighting. Adolf Hitler insisted that the Donbas must be held at all costs, believing its loss would be a strategic and psychological blow. Stalin, by contrast, demanded speed, urging commanders to press the offensive despite high casualties in order to demonstrate Soviet momentum to both domestic and Allied audiences. Propaganda in Moscow framed the victories as the recovery of the nation's heart of industry, while German communiques sought to downplay retreats, describing them as tactical withdrawals. By November, the climax of the Donbas offensive had passed. The Red Army had recaptured most of the industrial basin, though at the price of immense losses. Soviet records list over 180,000 casualties during the offensive, including dead, wounded, and missing. German losses, though smaller in absolute numbers, were proportionally devastating, with entire divisions reduced to regimental strength. The Wehrmacht's failure to hold the Donbas represented not just a battlefield defeat, but the collapse of a major strategic resource base that Germany could not replace. The peak of the campaign thus marked a decisive moment: the destruction of German hopes of stabilizing their southern front and the demonstration of the Red Army's growing capacity for large-scale offensive operations. From this point onward, the initiative remained firmly in Soviet hands, shaping the course of the wider Eastern Front. As the Donbas offensive moved into its later stages, the pattern of fighting shifted from sweeping armored thrusts to grueling battles of attrition. German forces, though increasingly weakened, did not simply collapse. Instead, they attempted to adapt their defensive strategy, employing mobile counterattacks in strongpoints anchored in urban centers. The Wehrmacht relied on divisions such as the 17th Panzer and elements of the 1st Panzer Army to conduct limited strikes against overextended Soviet spearheads, hoping to delay the Red Army and buy time for withdrawal. These efforts achieved localized success, briefly disrupting Soviet supply lines and causing heavy casualties, but they could not reverse the overall trajectory of the campaign. The Red Army also adapted its methods. Commanders had learned from earlier costly frontal assaults and increasingly emphasized coordinated use of artillery, armor, and infantry in combined arms operations. In the battles around Lysychansk and Artyomovsk, Soviet forces used massed artillery barrages to shatter defensive belts before advancing infantry, supported by tanks, moved in. Engineers played a crucial role in bridging rivers, clearing minefields, and restoring railways under fire. The Soviet General Staff prioritized the rapid reconstruction of logistical networks in liberated areas, ensuring a steady flow of ammunition and reinforcements despite the destruction left by retreating German forces. Partisan activity also intensified during this period, influencing the tactical environment. Soviet partisans, operating in the forests and steppe around the Donbas, sabotaged German rail lines, attacked supply convoys, and gathered intelligence for advancing Soviet armies. Reports indicate that in August and September alone, partisan detachments destroyed dozens of locomotives and hundreds of rail cars, further undermining German mobility. The presence of these irregular forces complicated German withdrawals, forcing them to allocate combat troops for rear area security and stretching their already limited resources. Morale played a decisive role in the resistance and adaptation of both sides. For German soldiers, the retreat from the Donbas was a stark contrast to the rapid victories of 1941. Diaries and surviving correspondence reveal fatigue, disillusionment, and a sense of inevitability about eventual defeat. Soviet troops, by contrast, fought with the momentum of victory after Kursk, motivated by the prospect of liberating their homeland and reclaiming vital industrial territory. Soviet propaganda units worked actively to reinforce this spirit, distributing leaflets and broadcasting radio messages that highlighted the strategic importance of the Donbas and the sacrifices of frontline soldiers. Civilian populations in the region faced many inhabitants attempted to assist Soviet troops by providing intelligence or sheltering partisans, while others had been displaced by months of fighting. German authorities engaged in forced evacuations, taking skilled laborers westward to work in German industry. Soviet commissions later documented that entire families were uprooted, with hundreds of thousands of civilians transported against their will. At the same time, in areas temporarily held by German forces, reprisals against suspected partisan collaborators were harsh, contributing to widespread suffering and fear. The material devastation of the Donbas became increasingly apparent. Industrial centers like Krasny Luch and Gorlovka were left in ruins, with power plants demolished, coal mines flooded, and transport networks dismantled. German demolition units systematically targeted key facilities to deny their use to the Red Army. Soviet engineers who entered these cities described scenes of deliberate destruction, machinery stripped, shafts filled with explosives, and bridges reduced to rubble. The Red Army recognized that while territorial control was regained, restoring production capacity would require years of reconstruction. International observers also took note of these developments. British and American intelligence assessments highlighted the importance of the Donbas as a critical test of Soviet offensive capability. Reports sent to London and Washington in late 1943 noted that the Red Army's ability to retake and hold the Donbas demonstrated both operational maturity and the scale of Soviet manpower reserves. These observations influenced Allied strategic planning. Orders were issued to prepare for further withdrawal toward the Dnieper River line, prioritizing the evacuation of surviving troops and whatever equipment could be salvaged. Despite localized counterattacks, German forces increasingly shifted to rearguard actions, covering retreats rather than seeking decisive engagements. Soviet troops pressed their advantage, continuing to harry the retreating enemy and consolidating control over the industrial basin. This stage of resistance and adaptation highlighted the changing balance of the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht was still capable of inflicting losses and conducting effective local operations, but its capacity for sustained defense was eroding. The Red Army, conversely, demonstrated both resilience and growing sophistication in coordinating large-scale offensives. For civilians, the cost remained immense: displacement, forced labor, and the destruction of livelihoods. Yet, from the Soviet perspective, the liberation of the Donbas marked not only a territorial gain, but also a psychological victory, reinforcing the image of a Red Army that had transformed from a defensive force in 1941 into an instrument capable of strategic offensives across an immense front. The Donbas offensive entered its decisive phase in late October and November 1943, when a critical turning point emerged both on the battlefield and in the broader strategic calculus of the war. Soviet forces, building on months of pressure, sought to deliver a final blow that would expel the Wehrmacht from the industrial heartland once and for all. For the Germans, the prospect of holding the Donbas was slipping beyond reach, despite repeated directives from Hitler demanding that every inch of ground be defended. At this stage, the Soviet High Command concentrated overwhelming forces. The Southwestern Front and Southern Front coordinated their movements to envelop German strongholds and sever their lines of retreat. Malinovsky's and Tolbukin's armies pressed forward with over 1 million troops, more than 1,000 tanks, and a steady stream of artillery and air support. The Soviet objective was not only to reclaim territory, but also to destroy German formations before they could withdraw in an orderly fashion. The capture of key cities such as Gorlovka, Makeyevka, and eventually Stalino, Donetsk, represented not just symbolic victories, but also vital steps in regaining the industrial assets of the basin. The Wehrmacht, however, did not collapse immediately. Army Group South attempted to stage delaying actions, using fortified positions, counterattacks by armored divisions, and scorched earth tactics to slow the Soviet advance. German commanders like Manstein recognized the futility of holding fixed positions indefinitely, but sought to extract their forces in fighting withdrawals. In this phase, the German strategy became increasingly focused on preserving combat power for the defense of the Dnieper line, which was already under Soviet pressure further north. A turning point came with the fall of Stalino on 8 September, followed by the steady capture of the surrounding coal and steel towns in October and November. Soviet troops entering these cities found them devastated, power plants dynamited, mines flooded, and entire industrial complexes dismantled or destroyed. German demolition units, acting under orders, had ensured that as little as possible remained functional. The Red Army achieved its territorial objective, but the economic prize was largely denied. This paradox highlighted the nature of total war. Victory in combat did not immediately restore productive capacity, and reconstruction would become a long-term challenge for Soviet authorities. Casualties underscored the scale of the turning point. Soviet records indicate that the Donbas offensive, running from August to November, cost the Red Army approximately 180,000 to 200,000 casualties, including dead, wounded, and missing. German losses, though fewer in absolute numbers, were proportionally crippling, with divisions reduced to skeletal strength. Entire regiments were absorbed into composite battle groups, and tank divisions often had fewer than 40 operational vehicles by the end of the fighting. This attrition weakened Army Group South to such an extent that its capacity to hold the Dnieper became questionable. The civilian dimension of the turning point was equally stark. Soviet civilians who had endured 2 years of German occupation were liberated, but liberation came with devastation. Industrial sites were unusable, food supplies scarce, and infrastructure shattered. Many civilians had been deported by German authorities during the retreat, sent westward for forced labor. Those who remained faced immediate hardship and uncertainty. Soviet reports noted widespread homelessness and starvation in liberated zones, forcing the Red Army to allocate resources to humanitarian relief alongside military operations. Politically, the turning point of the Donbas offensive reinforced Stalin's position domestically and internationally. The recovery of the Donbas was presented as a triumph of Soviet will and military capacity. Propaganda emphasized the restoration of the coal and steel heart of the nation. Internationally, the offensive demonstrated to the Allies that the Soviet Union was not only holding the line, but actively reclaiming critical territory. British and American observers concluded that the Eastern Front would remain the decisive theater, shaping the timing and urgency of Allied plans for a second front in France. On the German side, the loss of the Donbas was received with alarm. Hitler's insistence on defending the industrial basin to the last man had forced German troops into costly attrition battles that they could ill afford. The retreat, though partially successful in extracting forces to the Dnieper line, undermined Hitler's credibility with his generals, who increasingly recognized the futility of rigid defensive orders. For the German war economy, the loss of Donbas coal and iron worsened already critical shortages, deepening reliance on occupied Western Europe and imports from the Balkans. Militarily, the turning point of the Donbas offensive shifted the broader balance of the Eastern Front. With the Donbas secured, the Red Army not only regained an industrial base, but also advanced to the Dnieper, setting the stage for subsequent offensives into Ukraine and beyond. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, found itself overextended, understrength, and on the defensive. The operational initiative had decisively passed to the Soviets, and the ability of Germany to regain momentum on the Eastern Front was effectively lost. By the end of November 1943, the turning point was clear to all participants. Soviet troops occupied the ruins of the Donbas cities, consolidating gains and preparing for further offensives. German forces, bloodied and retreating, clung to positions along the Dnieper, hoping to stabilize the front. Civilians faced the aftermath of destruction, with little immediate relief in sight. In this convergence of military, economic, and political factors, the Donbas offensive marked not only the turning of a campaign, but also a decisive shift in the wider war. This turning point symbolized the irreversible erosion of German power in the East and the ascendant momentum of the Red Army. The Donbas, once the object of German exploitation, now stood as a testament to Soviet resilience and sacrifice. From here onward, the strategic balance of the war on the Eastern Front tilted inexorably toward the Soviet Union, shaping the outcome of the conflict in Europe. By late November 1943, active combat in the Donbas had largely subsided, giving way to the difficult process of consolidation and withdrawal. The Red Army now controlled most of the industrial basin, and Soviet commanders shifted focus to reorganizing their forces for subsequent operations toward the Dnieper and beyond. For the Wehrmacht, the Donbas campaign ended in a series of rearguard battles as units retreated westward under constant pressure, seeking to avoid encirclement and preserve combat power for the defense of the Dnieper line. The immediate aftermath was shaped by logistical challenges. Soviet forces, though victorious, were exhausted after months of continuous operations. Many divisions had suffered casualty rates exceeding 30%, and armored units reported high levels of mechanical breakdowns. The destruction left behind by retreating German forces compounded these difficulties. Railways were torn up, bridges demolished, and mines flooded. Soviet engineers worked around the clock to restore transport routes, but movement of supplies remained slow, hampering both the reconstitution of frontline units and the delivery of humanitarian aid to liberated populations. German withdrawal was not without cost. Army Group South lost much of its heavy equipment during the retreat, either destroyed in battle or abandoned due to lack of fuel and transport. Soviet estimates suggest that by December, dozens of German divisions in the sector had been reduced to one-third of their nominal strength. The withdrawal did allow the Wehrmacht to establish a more coherent line along the Dnieper, but it was increasingly clear that the loss of the Donbas had inflicted irreversible damage to Germany's strategic position in the east. For civilians, the consequences were stark. The liberation of the Donbas exposed the scale of devastation left by 2 years of German occupation. Thousands of homes lay in ruins, entire towns had been depopulated, and famine conditions emerged as food stores were depleted or destroyed. Soviet authorities documented widespread deportations. Hundreds of thousands of men and women had been transported west to serve as forced laborers in Germany. Those who remained behind often had no shelter or means of survival during the onset of winter. Relief efforts, coordinated by Soviet military administrations, distributed limited supplies of bread, clothing, and coal, but conditions remained dire. Politically, the aftermath reinforced Soviet prestige. Stalin emphasized the liberation of the Donbas as a decisive achievement, highlighting the region's symbolic and economic importance. The victory fed into Soviet propaganda, which presented the Red Army as the defender and liberator of the nation. At the same time, Soviet authorities faced the challenge of rebuilding an industrial landscape deliberately devastated by the enemy. The loss of the Donbas denied the Reich access to vital coal and iron resources, deepening dependence on vulnerable supply routes from occupied territories in the Balkans and Western Europe. Hitler's insistence on holding the region had cost the Wehrmacht heavily, while yielding little strategic benefit. The retreat, though necessary, marked a further erosion of German credibility, both among its own commanders and within the Axis alliance. In humanitarian terms, reprisals and devastation accompanied the German withdrawal. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned, and infrastructure essential to civilian survival was systematically destroyed. Soviet commissions later reported that more than half of the housing stock in the Donbas had been lost, and agricultural production collapsed due to scorched earth tactics. For the local population, the end of occupation did not immediately translate into relief, as they now faced the hardships of reconstruction amid widespread destruction. International observers, particularly from the United States and Britain, saw the Soviet victory in the Donbas as a clear demonstration of the Red Army's growing capability. Intelligence briefings in late 1943 concluded that the German ability to wage sustained defensive operations on the Eastern Front was diminishing rapidly. The aftermath of the Donbas offensive thus influenced Allied strategic planning, reinforcing the urgency of opening a second front in Western Europe to accelerate Germany's defeat. The withdrawal of the Wehrmacht from the Donbas, combined with the consolidation of Soviet control, marked the end of one of the most significant operations of 19. Yet in strategic terms, the outcome decisively shifted momentum toward the Soviet Union, preparing the way for the further offensives that would carry the Red Army to the western borders of the USSR in the following year. The Donbas strategic offensive left a legacy that extended far beyond the autumn of 1943. Militarily, it represented one of the decisive steps in the transformation of the Eastern Front. By retaking the Donbas, the Red Army not only deprived Germany of vital resources, but also proved its growing ability to conduct large-scale, coordinated operations across vast sectors. The campaign demonstrated improved Soviet operational art with better integration of armor, infantry, artillery, and air power, as well as more sophisticated logistical planning. It also marked the point at which the Red Army began to consistently hold the initiative, forcing the Wehrmacht into a continuous sequence of retreats that would not end until 1945. For Germany, the loss of the Donbas was a severe blow. The basin had supplied coal, iron, and steel critical to sustaining the war effort, and its destruction or capture drastically reduced German industrial capacity. Already strained by Allied bombing campaigns and overstretched fronts, the German war economy entered a deeper crisis. Army Group South never fully recovered from the losses suffered during the campaign, and the Wehrmacht's strategic reserve was too limited to compensate. The Donbas, once envisioned as part of Germany's economic foundation in the East, became a symbol of the failure of Hitler's strategy of conquest. Politically, the victory reinforced Soviet confidence. The recapture of the Donbas allowed Stalin to present himself both to the Soviet people and to the Allies as the leader of a state not merely surviving, but advancing. The campaign was framed as the recovery. It also strengthened the USSR's position in negotiations with Britain and the United States, underlining the indispensable role of the Red Army in defeating Germany. Allied leaders recognized that the Soviet Union had achieved a victory of strategic importance, reinforcing commitments to coordinate offensives in Western Europe. The civilian legacy was complex and tragic. The Donbas population emerged from 2 years of occupation, facing devastation on an unprecedented scale. Industrial installations were systematically destroyed, housing was ruined, and food supplies were scarce. The Soviet state prioritized rebuilding the industrial base, launching reconstruction programs immediately after liberation, but these often placed economic recovery above humanitarian needs. Survivors endured displacement, shortages, and hardship well into the post-war. At the same time, the liberation of the Donbas was remembered locally as the end of forced labor, repression, and deportations under German occupation. From a historical perspective, the Donbas offensive stands as an example of the destructive logic of total war. The region, once central to Europe's industrial development, was reduced to ruins as both sides pursued military objectives at any cost. The campaign illustrated the extent to which modern war blurred the line between battlefield and civilian life, with factories, railways, and mines serving as both strategic targets and lifelines for local populations. The enormous losses suffered by both armies and the devastation inflicted upon the region reflected the broader pattern of the Eastern Front, decisive in scale, brutal in execution, and transformative in outcome. In the decades after the war, the Donbas offensive became monuments were erected in liberated cities, and anniversaries commemorated the campaign as part of the broader narrative of the Great Patriotic War. In Western historiography, it has often been overshadowed by larger and more dramatic battles such as Kursk or Stalingrad, yet the recovery of the Donbas was vital in shifting the balance of the war and undermining Germany's capacity to continue prolonged resistance. Ultimately, the legacy of the Donbas strategic offensive lies in its role as a turning point. It was not a single dramatic battle, but a sustained campaign of months that drained German strength, restored Soviet industry, and marked the irreversible erosion of German power on the Eastern Front. By the close of 1943, the initiative had firmly passed to the Red Army, and the path toward eventual victory in Eastern Europe had been opened. The Donbas